The silver butter knife clinked against the porcelain plate just as my son muttered, "You're just waiting to die, huh?" Still, I folded my napkin slowly, smoothing each crease while the warmth drained from the biscuits beside me. As the scent of butter and rosemary rose, it hit harder than his words. Familiar, comforting, undeserved. While their laughter dripped casual cruelty across the table, I watched the steam fade like respect in this house. The same knife I used to serve breakfast once signed the will that made them believe they'd already won. That's when I decided. They'd read their inheritance the way they read me. Too late, and without care. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Eleanor slid the biscuits onto the breakfast table with practiced grace, their golden crusts still warm from the oven. The smell, rich and buttery, filled the kitchen, cutting through the cool morning air. The table was set in its usual way. Polished wood, neatly folded napkins, a silver teapot steaming softly in the center. Yet, despite the warm scene, the atmosphere felt cold. A brittle tension hung in the room like dust motes, invisible but ever-present. Tyler, sprawled lazily in his chair, eyed the biscuits without enthusiasm. He yawned, the sound loud and unsettling in the otherwise quiet space, before reaching for his coffee. "You should travel more, Mom," he said, his voice flat, as if the suggestion were an afterthought. "But I guess you're just waiting to die." "Huh?" The words landed with the weight of a stone dropped into still water. For a brief moment, the world inside Eleanor's head tilted sideways. Her hand, mid-reach for the butter dish, froze. Her eyes, however, did not. She kept them fixed on the round table in front of her, as though the varnished surface could offer refuge. Lori smirked. A little too knowing, a little too satisfied. She didn't even flinch. Emily, hunched over her phone at the other end of the table, didn't look up. Her fingers flicked idly across the screen, scrolling through whatever had her attention this morning, as though nothing had just been said, as though nothing had changed. For a long moment, Eleanor said nothing. She took a breath, and then another, her chest tightening with the kind of quiet indignation that had become second nature to her. Then she set the butter down, slowly, carefully, before wiping her hands on the towel tucked in her apron. The silence that followed was heavy, full of things unsaid. "That's one way to say grace," Eleanor finally replied, her voice as steady as it was cold, a hint of steel beneath the words. Tyler didn't respond. Lori let out a soft, humorless chuckle, as if she hadn't expected any different. Emily remained absorbed in her screen, her face lit by the blue glow, her thumb moving in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Eleanor cleared the table in silence, her movements deliberate. She folded her cloth napkin tight, like a secret she didn't intend to share. Her fingers worked with precision, the delicate fabric creasing in her hands. There was something in the way she moved, slower than usual, but with an undeniable purpose that made the room feel smaller. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The absence of her words, the sheer weight of her silence, was louder than anything she could have said. The sound of the front door closing later that afternoon was as quiet as the house had been that morning. Tyler, Lori, and Emily had left. The house, for the first time in hours, felt empty. Alone. But not in the way she had once feared. The silence now felt like freedom. Her phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. The name on the screen made her stomach tighten for a moment before she answered. "Ellie." Ruth's voice crackled through the receiver, warm and familiar. "How's the will lookin'?" Eleanor paused. She leaned back against the counter, her fingers curling around the edge, grounding herself. "Just fine," she replied, her voice low, calm, no trace of emotion. "How about yours?" Ruth was quiet for a moment, the familiar rustle of papers on the other end of the line a comforting background noise. "You sure about this, Ellie?" Ruth asked, her tone not judgmental but heavy with something else, something Eleanor hadn't felt in years. Concern. I'm sure, Eleanor answered, the words simple but final. I've waited long enough. Ruth's sigh was a strange mixture of understanding and resignation. Well, it's done then. No turning back. No, Eleanor agreed, her hand tightening on the phone. There's no going back. The line fell silent, the weight of the decision between them. Neither of them needed to say more. Ruth knew. Eleanor knew. They both knew this wasn't about money or property or any of the things Tyler and Lori had taken for granted. It was about something deeper, something unspoken. Ruth finally broke the silence. You know, Ellie, if they can't see you for who you are by now, they never will. Eleanor stood taller, her back straighter, as though Ruth's words had given her a silent affirmation. That's the problem, isn't it? They never looked. The call ended, but Eleanor didn't move right away. She remained there, standing in the quiet kitchen, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound filling the space. She ran a hand through her silver hair, her gaze falling on the empty chair at the head of the table where Tyler had sat, the place where he'd made his careless, cutting remark. Her hand twitched, but she didn't reach for the phone. Not yet. She would, though. Soon. There were things left to finish. Things she had no intention of leaving undone. The front door creaked open again, and Eleanor's heart didn't race. She was prepared now. Tyler, Lori, and Emily would never understand. But they'd have to live with the consequences of their words, just as she would live with hers. The house, the legacy, everything had shifted. They didn't know it yet, but they would soon. And when they did, it would be too late. Eleanor stood in the doorway of her home office, the soft light of the afternoon spilling over the bookshelves and scattered papers. She hadn't been in here much lately. Too many things left unsaid. Too many quiet hours filled with the hum of thoughts she wasn't ready to confront. The room smelled faintly of old books, dust, and the faintest trace of lavender from the vase of dried flowers in the corner. Her hand rested on the brass doorknob, the weight of it almost comforting. She'd never been one to shy away from difficult decisions, but this one felt different. This was the last step. She walked past the desk where stacks of papers lay untouched, the family photos at the edge of the surface half faded under years of neglect. It was the filing cabinet she approached, a tall, sturdy piece of furniture that had long since ceased to be the ally it once was in her life. Her fingers brushed against the wood as she opened the bottom drawer. She paused. There it was, the folder. Simple, unassuming, labeled in neat block letters, Will. Active, 2023. The very sight of it stirred a strange sensation in her chest. She pulled it out, the manila paper crinkling slightly under her touch. For a moment she just held it, the weight of the folder grounding her in a way she hadn't felt in days. Then, without another word, she laid it on the desk and opened it. Inside, there were the familiar things. A series of photographs from family holidays, moments of what once felt like togetherness frozen in time. There was a picture of her and Tyler taken in front of the house, their smiles wide, untainted by the years that would follow. Another of Emily at Christmas, her face aglow with the innocent joy of youth. They were all there, faces she had once loved unconditionally. Eleanor's fingers brushed the edges of the photographs, the memories rising unbidden. She remembered the day she'd added Tyler and Emily as co-beneficiaries. It had been a rainy afternoon in the spring, the air thick with the kind of moisture that made everything feel heavier. She had sat at the dining table, pen in hand, reading through the legal papers with a focus she hadn't quite understood at the time. Tyler had smiled at her across the table, that easy, confident smile he used when he wanted something, and Emily, barely out of high school, had clung to her approval with that same unspoken need. She had thought, hoped that this gesture of trust would bind them together, that her giving them a piece of her life would somehow mean they would see her as more than just an inheritance, more than just a name on a paper. When she signed, she'd even cried a little. Not out of sadness, but out of something softer. A fragile belief in the possibility of change, in the hope that her generosity might bring them closer. Ruth had laughed when she told her. "You cried when they didn't deserve wet napkins," she had said, her voice both amused and sharp. "Let me guess. Tyler and Emily got all the good stuff, right?" Eleanor's lips curved at the memory, the sting of Ruth's truth still sharp. How right she had been. How naive Eleanor had been to think they could be trusted with anything so valuable. She flipped past the photos, her eyes scanning the signatures, Tyler's bold and confident, Emily's a quick flourish, barely legible. It all seemed so simple then, so easy to believe in. But now, the signature pages felt like a betrayal, like a lifetime ago. Eleanor's breath hitched. She was done. This was the moment. Her fingers hovered over the phone on the desk, and without hesitation she dialed the number she had memorized by heart, Noah Delgado, her attorney. The one person who knew how to make things disappear, and how to make them disappear without a trace. The line rang once, twice, a third time. "Delgado," he answered, his voice crisp, unflinching as always. "Noah, it's Eleanor," she said, her voice steady but laden with intent. "I'd like to revoke, redirect, and relabel." There was a beat of silence on the other end. "Effective immediately?" he asked, as though it was a formality, as though the weight of the decision hadn't settled between them like smoke from a fire that was already burning. "Already is," she replied, her words final, her hand tightening on the receiver as if it were her lifeline, anchoring her to the decision she had already made. She didn't need to explain. Noah knew the severity of it. He knew what was at stake. "Consider it done," he said. The calm finality in his voice made her chest tighten. There was no going back. Not now. Eleanor closed the folder with deliberate care. She felt the weight of the decisions she had made, and the ones still to come. There was no room left for doubt. There never had been. The phone call ended, but Eleanor didn't move immediately. Instead, she stood there, her eyes fixed on the closed file, the legacy she had spent years shaping now restructured, redirected, out of reach, for those who thought they were owed it all. For the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt a sense of certainty settle over her. The pieces had fallen into place. She would never again be at the mercy of their expectations. The sound of the clock ticking in the background was the only thing that kept her grounded. Time, she thought, was a strange thing. It could run out. Or it could stretch on forever. But in this moment, she had control. And she wasn't going to wait to die. Not for anyone. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the sprawling backyard as Eleanor stood in the kitchen, the scent of fresh coffee mingling with the faint smell of dust in the air. Laurie's voice broke the silence, high and expectant. "You know, Eleanor," she said, a flurry of excitement in her tone. "If we're really going to update this kitchen, I'm thinking maybe something bold. A backsplash, maybe even a kitchen island. Something fresh. Something to—" She paused, glancing at Eleanor for confirmation. "Well, you know, modernize it. Add value." Eleanor's eyes didn't flicker toward the plans Laurie had spread out on the counter, a glossy brochure that promised sleek designs and elegant finishes. Instead, her gaze stayed fixed on the worn oak cabinets, the ones that had been here long before Laurie ever stepped foot in the house. The ones that had absorbed decades of conversation, love, and loss. Eleanor gave a polite nod. "Of course," she said, her voice smooth, carefully measured. "I hope you wake up soon." Laurie chuckled, the laugh hollow, like it was meant to hide something. "We're just dreaming, right? Don't mind me." Eleanor didn't smile. Instead, she turned and walked toward the door, the creaking floorboards a familiar rhythm underfoot. "Dreams are harmless," she replied quietly. "But not everything worth having comes to life in them." Lori didn't respond. She didn't need to. The next morning, Eleanor stood in the same office where she had made her final decision the day before. She had been up for hours, sitting in the silence, letting the weight of her actions settle. The folder, the phone call, everything had led to this. Noah Delgado was already there when she arrived, sitting behind the massive mahogany desk that seemed to make everything else in the room feel small. He looked up as she entered, his sharp eyes acknowledging her with a nod. "Good morning, Eleanor," he said, sliding a fresh set of papers toward her. His movements were swift, deliberate, a practiced ease in everything he did. "All set for the final draft?" Eleanor didn't sit. She hovered for a moment by the door, watching as he adjusted the papers, his hands quick and sure. She didn't need to check it. She knew what was there. She could feel it already, a sense of finality settling over the air between them. Her signature, as clean and sharp as a knife, would be the last thing to seal it. "Yes," she said, her voice steady, without hesitation. "It's done." Noah pushed the papers closer to her, his pen hovering. "You're sure about removing all three names? Tyler, Lori, and Emily? No one else needs to be on here?" Eleanor's eyes flicked to the names on the document. She could see their signatures in her mind. Tyler's bold, Lori's scribbled, and Emily's barely legible. The mockery of it all. "I'm sure," Eleanor replied, her voice as cold and unflinching as the paper before her. "The house doesn't belong to them. Not anymore." Noah didn't ask any more questions. He didn't need to. He understood. The will was hers, and now it would reflect what had always been hers: control, decision, consequence. She took the pen from him, the small weight of it comforting. She signed with the same precise stroke she'd used the day before, sealing the new chapter. The house, the legacy, it was all in her hands now. No one could claim it without her permission. He nodded as she placed the pen down. "It's done," he said simply, as if this were just another Tuesday. But Eleanor knew better. This wasn't a simple formality. This was the end of everything they thought they knew about her. She stood, pushing the papers aside and sliding them into the folder with the same deliberation as before. Noah stood too, offering her the customary handshake. His hand was firm, but she could feel the subtle recognition in the pressure. This wasn't just a transaction. It was the quiet unraveling of an empire they'd all thought they understood. The morning sun bathed the office in a muted light, the papers now locked away in the file drawer, and with it, a new kind of certainty. Eleanor was no longer waiting for the world to adjust to her. She had already adjusted it to her own design. Ruth met her at the diner later that day, a lukewarm mug of coffee waiting for her. The diner was empty, the clink of silverware, and the low hum of the neon lights adding to the surreal nature of the moment. Ruth slid into the booth across from her, her eyes scanning the room before landing on Eleanor's face. "Well?" Ruth asked, raising her mug in a silent toast. "Feels good, doesn't it?" Eleanor took the mug without a word, the familiar bitterness of the coffee filling her mouth as she took a sip. For a moment she let the silence linger between them, the weight of everything that had happened settling around them like the fog outside the window. "Better than forgiveness," Eleanor said, her voice low but steady. The words were simple, but they rang with the clarity of someone who had finally stopped pretending. She wasn't here to fix anything. She was here to reshape it. Ruth leaned back in her seat, her smile slow, knowing. "Well, I'll drink to that," she said, raising her mug again. Eleanor watched her friend for a long moment. Ruth had always been the one who saw beyond the surface, who understood what needed to be done before it even occurred to Eleanor. It was Ruth who had whispered the hard truths when no one else dared to, and it was Ruth who now saw the satisfaction in the subtle rebellion that had taken place. "Here's to no more waiting," Eleanor said quietly, her eyes meeting Ruth's over the rim of the cup. Ruth's laugh was low, deep, and full of understanding. The kind that only came with time. Outside, the wind began to pick up, the branches of the trees tapping against the windows. It was just another day, just another moment in the long, quiet war of words and decisions that had already been fought. But Eleanor was no longer waiting for the house to settle into their hands. It was hers now, and it always had been. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, her fingers moving slowly across the edge of her phone, the soft glow from the screen casting shadows across her hands. She'd only opened it for a moment, expecting the usual flood of notifications, emails, messages from Ruth, the occasional political rant from people she barely knew. But something caught her eye. A name. Her name. And then, a post. She tapped on it, her heartbeat quickening as she read the words. "Eleanor Graydon is no longer fit to make decisions for herself. After a lifetime of generosity, it seems she's finally chosen to repay those who loved her with cruelty. What was once hers now belongs to no one but her own ego. Even her son and granddaughter, who she once trusted, are left with nothing but empty memories. A sad, final chapter for the matriarch of the Graydon family." The comments flooded in after that, some sympathetic, others more vicious, a mix of strangers and distant relatives, all weighing in on what they didn't understand. There was no mention of the truth, no mention of what had actually happened. The betrayal, the years of manipulation, the disregard. It was all buried beneath a lie wrapped in a veneer of concern. Eleanor set the phone down slowly, her jaw tight. She had expected this. She had known it was coming, but that didn't make it any easier to bear. The false narrative, the twisted sympathy, it stung more than she cared to admit. From the corner of the room, Ruth's voice broke the silence. She was standing in the doorway, arms crossed, watching Eleanor with a knowing gaze. "Let 'em perform," Ruth said, her tone matter-of-fact. "You're working with contracts now." Eleanor didn't respond at first, her fingers twitching involuntarily as if she were about to swipe the post away. But she didn't. She let it sit there. The lie, the distortion. She knew the truth would hold more weight in the end. Instead, she reached for her phone again, her thumb moving over the screen with precise intention. She found Emily's name, the one she had removed from her will, the one she had thought was safe to trust. The girl who, despite everything, had chosen sides without ever considering the cost. Eleanor's fingers hovered over the button to delete her as the healthcare proxy. It was a simple task. She'd already made the decision. There would be no more grandmotherly love left to cloud her judgment. Emily was a casualty in a war she hadn't seen coming, a war Eleanor had prepared for in silence. Instead of hitting the delete button, Eleanor tapped the option to replace the name. Her gaze flickered to Ruth, who had taken a seat across from her, her expression unreadable. "I'll replace it with yours," Eleanor said quietly. "You'll keep the plug-in until I say otherwise." Ruth raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in her eyes. "Girl, I'll plug in music if I have to." Eleanor's lips twitched in the faintest semblance of a smile. It wasn't much, but it was something. An acknowledgement of the gravity of what she had just decided, what she had just taken from them. She pressed the button. It was done. The room seemed to hold its breath for a moment. There was no fanfare, no rush of adrenaline. Only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that she had taken control, not just of the house, but of everything that mattered now. The threads that had once bound her to them, Tyler, Emily, even Lori, were fraying, unraveling, severed cleanly. The decisions had been made, and they couldn't unmake them. Ruth stood up, moving to the counter to refill her coffee. She didn't look back at Eleanor, but the silence between them said everything. The finality wasn't just in the will or in the changes she had made. It was in the space that had opened up between them, the distance between the woman who had finally taken back her life and the ones who had thought they could control her. "You're quiet today," Ruth remarked, a playful edge to her voice. "I thought I'd get at least a laugh, or a cheer, or something. Instead, you look like you've just won a battle." Eleanor didn't answer immediately. She just looked at the phone in her hands, the screen still lit up with the post and its lies. "I've won more than a battle," Eleanor said, finally raising her gaze. Her voice was calm, a controlled certainty that had settled over her like an old familiar coat. "I've won a war they didn't even know they were fighting." She stood then, gathering the papers from the kitchen counter with quiet precision. They would go in the file drawer alongside the others: contracts, revisions, final drafts. They were all part of the legacy she was building, the one she had not chosen for them, but the one they had earned. Ruth, sensing the shift, said nothing more. Instead, she picked up her coffee, took a long sip, and let the silence stretch. She knew, better than anyone, that Eleanor wasn't done yet. Eleanor moved past her, her steps measured. There was nothing left to prove, nothing to say. Outside, the wind howled, sending a shiver through the trees. The house, her house, stood tall against it all, steady and unmoving. Inside, Eleanor's decisions would reverberate through the halls, unnoticed by the ones who thought they knew her. She wasn't waiting anymore. She was living. And nothing they said or did could change that now. The table was set with care, each dish arranged like a carefully crafted illusion. The deep red of the wine glinted in the glasses, the pale light of the chandelier casting long shadows over the polished surface. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, the chair that had once belonged to her late husband, now a place she commanded with calm authority. Her eyes, cool and steady, swept across the room, taking in the familiar faces, the ones she had once believed would be by her side, forever. Tyler, dressed in a suit that screamed entitlement, stood near the kitchen island, pouring the wine with exaggerated elegance, his back turned toward her as though he was performing for an audience. Lori sat across from Eleanor, her posture poised, hands folded delicately on the table. She smiled thinly, but her eyes held the same calculating gleam Eleanor had grown used to over the years. Emily, at the far end, barely touched her glass, the faintest trace of a smile playing on her lips. The kind of smile that was more a mask than a gesture of warmth. Eleanor didn't need to ask the question they all wanted her to ask. She had been here before, over and over, this ritual where they pretended at civility, at love, at family. The wine was a prop, the conversation, a performance, and she, the audience. Tyler set his glass down, his voice a little too loud, trying too hard to fill the silence. "We've been thinking," he said, turning to face Eleanor, his face a mask of practiced concern. "About the future, about the house." His hands gestured vaguely toward the walls, the old wood, the relics of the life they had all once shared. Eleanor didn't flinch. She met his gaze with the same coolness she had shown when she signed the papers, when she finalized everything. Her voice was calm, a gentle ripple on the surface of the storm brewing beneath her skin. "So have I." There was a pause. But Tyler's eyes flickered with the slightest hesitation. Lori, ever the opportunist, seized the moment, leaning forward slightly as if offering her condolences for some invisible wound. "If you ever feel like you can't manage it alone," she said, her tone laced with that insufferable sweetness, "we're here for you, Eleanor. You don't have to do this on your own." Eleanor's smile was a razor-thin line, her gaze unwavering. I've already solved for that, she said, her voice smooth, final. She didn't need to say more. There was no room for misunderstanding. Emily, who had been quiet up until now, shifted in her seat, her smile faltering for just a second. She wasn't used to being left out of these conversations. Her voice came out too soft, almost rehearsed. "We'd love to help," she said, as though offering some balm to the wounded family she had once been a part of. Eleanor's response cut through the air, cold and sharp. "You're not on the paperwork anymore." The words landed like stones thrown into water, rippling outward, breaking the surface of their carefully constructed facade. For a moment, the room went still. The clink of silverware, the murmur of conversation, all of it stopped, as though the air had been sucked from the room. Tyler's face stiffened, the wine glass froze in midair as his eyes locked onto hers. Laurie's lips parted, the shock in her expression quickly masked by a thin veneer of controlled indifference. But Emily's gaze dropped to the table, her fingers curling tighter around her napkin, the truth settling in her stomach like something sour. Eleanor didn't blink. She didn't need to. Tyler was the first to recover, his voice forced but steady, the hint of anger simmering beneath the surface. "You can't be serious," he said, his jaw tight, a thin sheen of sweat already gathering at his temples. "This isn't how it works, Mom. You can't just erase us." "Watch me," Eleanor interrupted, her voice low but packed with finality. She hadn't moved, hadn't even adjusted her posture. She was as still as a mountain, unshaken by the storm they were creating around her. The air felt heavier now, thick with tension. No one spoke for a long moment, the weight of her words hanging in the space between them like a thick fog. Emily's fingers were trembling slightly as she reached for her glass, but even she knew better than to raise it now. Her role had changed. She was no longer the favored granddaughter. She was a ghost in the room. Laurie, ever the tactician, recovered first. She placed her napkin down with slow, deliberate care, her eyes flicking between Eleanor and Tyler. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice laced with a hint of disbelief that bordered on anger. "You're punishing us for something we didn't even—" "No," Eleanor said, cutting her off with the quiet power of someone who had heard this argument 1,000 times before. "I'm not punishing you. I'm freeing myself." The words fell, simple and definitive, hanging in the air like the ringing of a bell. Ruth's voice echoed in Eleanor's mind, a soft whisper of affirmation. Let 'em perform. They had been performing for years, and now, the curtain had finally fallen. Tyler stared at her for a long moment, his face reddening with frustration. But there was something else there, too. Something beneath the anger that flickered in his eyes. A flicker of realization. This was no longer a game. The meal continued in stilted, forced silence, the conversation now nothing more than a string of empty words, a charade for the sake of keeping up appearances. But Eleanor knew the truth. They were the ones who had been fooled all along. The house, the legacy, it had never been theirs. Not really. And now, as the evening stretched on, with the wine growing colder and the smiles growing tighter, Eleanor realized something that made the hollow taste of the meal even worse. They had been waiting for her to die, but what they hadn't counted on was her choosing to live. And that, as it turned out, was the one thing they couldn't take from her. The silence that followed Eleanor's departure from the dinner table was thick, as though the air itself had become dense with the unsaid words hanging between them. Tyler stared down at the document in his hands, his knuckles white as he gripped it with a force that threatened to tear the pages. His breath was shallow, his eyes darting across the legal jargon, searching for any loophole, anything that would explain this betrayal. "This isn't legal," he said, his voice rising with a mix of disbelief and anger. "You didn't tell us. You didn't even mention any of this." Eleanor remained motionless in the doorway, her silhouette outlined by the dim light in the hallway. Her calm voice carried over the space, a quiet certainty that unsettled them all. "That's because it doesn't concern you anymore." Tyler's mouth opened, but the words wouldn't come. Lori, ever the tactician, quickly snapped her focus away from Eleanor's figure, her attention now entirely on the papers in Tyler's hands. "This can't be real, Eleanor. You can't just cut us out of your life like this. The house, everything. It's all ours, too." Eleanor's gaze was unflinching, her face unreadable. She stepped back into the dining room, but instead of resuming her seat, she took a deliberate step away from the table. "Cruel was breakfast," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a sharp knife. This is liberation." Lori's face twisted with a mixture of frustration and anger, but Eleanor simply turned, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor as she excused herself from the table. Her plate, still full, untouched, remained there, as though the dinner itself was a mere formality, a ritual they would never truly finish. She didn't need to explain herself further. There was nothing more to say. She walked to the kitchen and then toward the back door, the evening air cool against her skin. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt like an echo chamber, reverberating with their disbelief and her resolve. Outside, the sky was tinged with the soft glow of twilight, the distant hum of the world beyond the house only adding to the sense of finality that clung to her like a second skin. She stood for a moment on the porch, her eyes fixed on the horizon, watching the last remnants of sunlight slip away. This was her choice now. The house, the legacy, everything that had once been taken for granted, it was hers again, in a way it had never truly been before. The phone in her pocket vibrated, breaking the stillness. She fished it out and glanced at the screen. It was Ruth. Eleanor answered without hesitation. "Well?" Ruth's voice was steady, but Eleanor could hear the underlying excitement in her tone. "Did you show them the new terms?" Eleanor's lips curled into a small smile, though no one could see it. "I showed them the end of assumptions," she replied softly. There was nothing more to explain, nothing more to prove. The game had changed, and now it was their turn to catch up. The sound of her footsteps on the porch was drowned out by another vibration in her hand. Eleanor's eyes flicked to the screen again, the familiar name causing a ripple of annoyance to pass through her. It was Emily. The text was simple, but loaded with the weight of desperation. "Can we talk? Just us?" Eleanor's finger hovered over the screen, the invitation to engage a temptation that was hard to resist. She could already hear the tremor in Emily's voice, the forced sweetness, the plea for understanding. But Eleanor knew better. She wasn't interested in their apologies anymore, not in their explanations or attempts to win her back. They had shown their true colors. It wasn't her job to comfort them. Her finger hovered over the message, and for a moment she almost typed a response, but then she stopped. What could she say? Emily didn't want the truth. She wanted to keep pretending that the past could be rewritten, that everything could be fixed with a few words, a few gestures. Eleanor deleted the text without replying. She wouldn't be swayed. Instead, she stepped back into the house, her gaze sweeping over the familiar rooms. The silence had a weight to it now, something she could almost touch. She had expected this moment to feel different, heavier, perhaps, but it didn't. It felt final. And she realized that, in a way, it had always been this way. She had been walking toward this for years, and now that it was here, there was nothing left to fear. No more compromises, no more giving in. The house felt like hers again. For the first time in a long time, Eleanor felt like she had reclaimed something that had always belonged to her. She set her phone down on the counter, its screen dark, the world on the other side of the glass just waiting for her to make her next move. And as she stood there, looking at the emptiness in front of her, she realized something else. The finality of her decision wasn't just in the will, it wasn't just in the way she had walked away from dinner, it was in the knowledge that no matter how much they fought against it, no matter how much they begged or accused her of cruelty, she would never go back. She wasn't the one who had changed. It was them, and they would have to live with it. The soft buzz of her phone in the quiet kitchen was the last thing to break the silence. This time, she didn't look at it. There was nothing more to say. The doorbell rang, its sharp tone cutting through the heavy silence that had settled over the house like a thick fog. Eleanor didn't need to check the time. She knew who it was before she even looked out the window. The scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered faintly in the air, too faint to be the brewing of her own pot, but strong enough to tell her Emily had arrived with her usual mixture of sweet talk and forced contrition. Eleanor walked slowly to the door, the floorboards creaking under her weight, the sound oddly comforting. She opened it without hesitation, her face still, as though the door had always belonged to her, as though Emily's arrival didn't disturb her in the slightest. And there she stood, in the doorway, holding a tray of coffee cups with the same practiced care she'd shown when they used to share afternoons together. "Hi, Grandma," Emily said, her voice too bright, too eager, a layer of false humility sitting heavily over the words. She stepped forward, holding out the tray like a peace offering. "I thought you might like some coffee. I brought it from that cafe you like." Eleanor's gaze flickered briefly to the tray, the steam rising from the cups. But she didn't take it. She didn't move, didn't reach for the coffee. Instead, her eyes locked onto Emily's, studying her face, reading the tension in her posture. She knew this act all too well. The sweetness was a mask, a thinly veiled attempt to undo what couldn't be undone. Emily cleared her throat, an uncomfortable shift in her stance as she waited for some kind of reaction. When none came, she stepped forward again, closer this time, trying to bridge the space between them with a disarming smile. I didn't mean it like that, Grandma. It was just a joke. You know I didn't mean anything by it." Eleanor's lips barely twitched, her eyes never leaving Emily's face. "You laughed too loud for it to be kind," she said quietly. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now, a weight that held the words down like a thick, unshakable truth. "Jokes like that don't just slip out, Emily. Not unless you've already decided it's okay to wound." There was a long pause, an awkwardness that grew thick between them, hanging in the air like the stifling heat of an afternoon sun. Emily's smile faltered, but she quickly regained her composure, pushing a lock of hair behind her ear as if to regain control of the situation. I've always looked up to you," she said, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "You've always been so strong, so wise. I thought we could be close again, you know? I've always admired you." Eleanor stood still, her hands folded loosely in front of her, the cool air of the house wrapping around her like a shield. "Then you've mistaken height for depth," she replied, her voice even, but the words were sharp enough to cut through Emily's veneer of humility. Emily's eyes flashed with something, resentment, or perhaps realization. Her hands tightened around the tray, the once offered gesture now a tether she couldn't quite escape. Eleanor watched her carefully, noticing the way Emily's shoulders tensed. The shift in her expression, the flicker of something deeper than guilt, something more like frustration. "I don't know what you expect from me," Eleanor continued, her tone calm but firm. "You've never understood me. You've only ever wanted me to be what you needed me to be. And I don't do that anymore." There was a long silence, broken only by the soft hum of the house, the distant sound of a car driving by outside. Emily seemed to shrink a little, the weight of Eleanor's words settling heavily on her chest. She opened her mouth as though to say something, but the words never came. Instead, Eleanor reached forward, her hand moving with a steady grace, and placed a small envelope onto the tray in front of Emily. "Here," she said, her voice as quiet as before, but with an unmistakable finality. "This is where money comes from now." Emily's fingers trembled slightly as she picked up the envelope, her brow furrowing as she turned it over. It was a scholarship application, a small, modest sum to fund a community grant for single-parent families. It wasn't a lot, but it was something. Something real. For students who are actually committed to something, not just those who think the world owes them, Eleanor added, her gaze sharp. "You've had plenty of chances to prove yourself, Emily. Maybe now you can try doing something that matters." Emily's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked down at the application, her face paling as she realized the weight of what Eleanor had just handed her. A challenge. A final verdict that had nothing to do with inheritance, nothing to do with family, but everything to do with proving herself. For the first time in the years that Eleanor had known her, Emily seemed small. Small in the way she stood there, staring at the application, her mouth hanging open in a mixture of disbelief and something else. Something Eleanor couldn't quite place. Finally, Emily looked up, meeting Eleanor's gaze. There was a long moment of quiet before she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to be like this," she said, a break in her voice. I thought it would be different." Eleanor didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned, her back to Emily as she moved to the window, looking out at the quiet street beyond. The house, her house, stretched out in front of her, empty and whole, just like it had always been. "I'm not the one who changed, Emily," she said quietly, her voice barely audible now. "It was you." The door clicked shut softly behind Emily as she left, and Eleanor stood there for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the empty street outside. She hadn't expected Emily to understand, and she never would. But that was the point, wasn't it? Eleanor turned back to the room, her heart steady, her resolve unshaken. The house was still hers, the legacy was still hers, and in the end, that was all that mattered. Eleanor stood at the window, the light of early morning spilling over the yard like a forgotten memory. Outside, the trees swayed gently in the breeze, casting long shadows across the front lawn. The house felt quieter now, the hum of its familiar rhythms already fading, as though it were surrendering to the inevitable. Inside, the stillness was overwhelming, but she didn't mind. It was the kind of peace she had been waiting for. A silence that wasn't a void, but a space of her own making. She had spent the night sorting through the rooms, packing what was necessary and leaving behind what no longer held meaning. The clutter of a life once shared was now reduced to boxes stacked in the corner, labeled and waiting. Her fingers touched the edges of each item carefully, her husband's old watch, the framed photograph from their honeymoon, the books she had never finished. Some would stay, others would go. Ruth appeared in the doorway, her gaze soft but knowing. She had always known what Eleanor needed before Eleanor had ever uttered a word. Ruth's hands were folded, her posture relaxed, but there was an edge to her voice when she spoke. "Not bad for a woman they buried with their words," she said, the corners of her lips turning up slightly. Eleanor didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked over to the shelf, pulling down a small brass clock that had belonged to her mother. The glass was cracked, the hand stopped, but it still held a place of importance. She carefully placed it in one of the boxes. "I wasn't buried," Eleanor finally replied, her voice measured. "I was just waiting for the right moment to leave." Ruth nodded, moving to help with the boxes. "You've always been good at waiting." The house had never felt smaller or emptier. Each step she took echoed through the quiet rooms, a reminder of the life she had lived here and the life she was about to leave behind. She hadn't expected it to feel like this. like a kind of freedom, but also like the weight of everything she had lost and reclaimed in the same breath. She turned, glancing at the mantel above the fireplace. Her eyes lingered on the family portraits there, the faces of people she had once tried so hard to please. But the truth was inescapable now. They had never understood her. They had only wanted from her. Wanted her time, her energy, her legacy. They had never asked if she wanted to give it. Eleanor walked slowly over to the mantel, her fingers brushing over the smooth wood. She had decided this house's fate long before any of them could have guessed. The decision had already been made. She had filed the papers, signed the legal documents, and by the time Tyler and Lori had demanded answers, it was too late. She had chosen what mattered, and that was all that needed to be done. Her eyes found the single piece of paper she had set aside for the last time she would leave this house. A note. Not for them, but for anyone who might think this house, this legacy, still belonged to them. She placed the note carefully on the mantel, its words clear and unyielding. Not for sale, not for you. It was a simple thing, but it was final. The house would no longer be a place for them to expect their inheritance or manipulate their way into. It would be kept under trust, its future secured as a local history museum, the story of the Graydon family told through the relics of a time when they had mattered, but not now, not anymore. She stepped back, her eyes tracing the edges of the room, the familiar angles that had been part of her life for decades. It was strange how something could feel like home for so long and still be so easy to walk away from. But she wasn't walking away. She was leaving it behind, reclaiming the space that had always been hers, but that she had been too afraid to fully take. "Everything's in place," Ruth said quietly, as though reading Eleanor's thoughts. She stood near the door, ready to leave, but there was no rush. Ruth was never in a hurry. Eleanor gave a small nod, her eyes fixed on the house. She could almost hear the whispers of memories, of past arguments, of promises never kept. But they were fading now, like smoke in the wind. The house had been a place of expectations. Now it would be a place of history. "No one will ever see it the way I do," Eleanor said, her voice barely a whisper. "But they'll remember it. Eventually." Ruth smiled, her expression full of knowing. "They'll never get the chance to change the story." Eleanor stepped toward the door, her fingers brushing the cool brass handle. She hesitated for only a moment, taking in the last view of the house. Her house, the home she had built, and the home she had taken back. With a final glance, she stepped outside, closing the door behind her with a soft click. There was no fanfare, no grand gestures, just the sound of the door shutting, and the quiet finality of it. It was done. And for the first time in years, Eleanor felt lighter. Tyler's knuckles were white against the steering wheel, the low hum of the engine the only sound in the car as he drove down the quiet street. The familiar stretch of road seemed somehow foreign now, each turn an echo of a life he thought he was entitled to. The house, his family's legacy, sat at the end of this road, waiting for him to claim it once more. Except it wasn't waiting for him anymore. He turned onto the familiar driveway, his heart quickening with the hope of finding something familiar in the place that had once been his. But as the house came into view, he could already tell. Something had changed. The lights were off, the windows dark, and as he pulled up to the curb, the weight of the situation hit him. The house was locked up tight, the overgrown ivy creeping along the walls as if it had been abandoned long ago. Tyler sat in the car for a moment, his chest tight with frustration. "This isn't how it's supposed to be," he thought, gripping the wheel harder. "This is ours. It was always ours." But it wasn't anymore. It had been taken from him. From them. Lori's voice echoed in his mind. Calm. Cool. The voice that always knew how to spin things. She'd called earlier, of course, after the will. after the shock, after the realization that nothing was as it seemed. She'd told him to go to the house, to find answers, but now there were no answers, just the cold emptiness of a house that had been cleaned out, stripped bare. Frustration bubbled in his chest as he climbed out of the car. The house looked untouched, almost too perfect. As if Eleanor had already moved on, leaving only a shell of what had once been. He pulled out his phone, tapping away with growing agitation. Laurie's post appeared on his screen. "When the elderly vanish, it's on us." The words stung, more out of their implication than the actual sentiment. Beneath it, the comments came flooding in, some offering sympathy, others questioning her motives. He could see it, even through the screen, the outrage, the disbelief, and the truth. That his mother had left them nothing but empty promises and a house they could no longer claim. He stared at the screen for a long moment as the comments grew harsher. They didn't get it. None of them did. They weren't supposed to have to fight for what was rightfully theirs. He tossed the phone onto the passenger seat in frustration. He couldn't stay here. Couldn't keep looking at the house as if it were something he could take back. It wasn't his anymore. Elsewhere, Ruth stood in the kitchen of her modest home, preparing a quiet cup of tea when her phone buzzed. She read the message without hesitation, a small, satisfied smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She was used to being the one who held the keys, who knew what had to be done. She'd given Eleanor the new address, of course. Only to the people who truly mattered, her lawyer, her doctor. She had made sure the ones who needed to know, who deserved to know, had the right details. It was the way Eleanor had always wanted it. Efficient, straightforward, with no room for the distractions that came with family expectations. Ruth knew Willow Glen would take good care of her. The new address wasn't one that would invite people like Tyler and Laurie to barge in and demand what wasn't theirs. Willow Glen was a community of quiet elegance, the kind of place that valued peace over spectacle. As Eleanor arrived, she felt the first true sense of calm she had known in years. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the neatly trimmed hedges and the gentle curves of the winding paths. The building, though simple, was a haven, offering everything Eleanor had longed for without the noise of the life she had left behind. Joanne, the community manager, greeted her at the door with a warm smile, the kind of genuine hospitality Eleanor hadn't encountered in ages. "I saved you a seat near the window," Joanne said, leading her to a table already set for one. It was simple, inviting, and exactly what Eleanor had needed. A place where no one would look at her with expectations. A place where she could truly be herself without the weight of family or legacy hanging over her. Eleanor sat down, the soft chair cradling her as though it had been waiting for her all along. Her fingers brushed the edges of the plate in front of her, a meal prepared with care. Not a moment too soon. The world outside the window was quiet now, peaceful, just as it should be. The sounds of distant birds, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing it all in. It wasn't just the new setting that brought her peace. It was the knowledge that the years she had spent bending to others' expectations were over. She wasn't waiting for anything anymore. Not for approval, not for anyone to catch up. When she opened her eyes again, she looked at Joanne, who had returned to give her a moment of solitude. "Feels like I never needed all that noise," Eleanor said quietly, a contented smile tugging at her lips. Joanne smiled back, her expression warm and understanding. "No one ever really does." As Eleanor sat there, the plate before her untouched for the moment, she realized something crucial. The world had been waiting for her to shrink, to disappear under the weight of others' needs. But she had reclaimed herself, and now, the only thing left for her to do was to live the way she always should have, quietly, on her own terms. It was, after all, The only legacy worth having. The house was quiet now, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of the wooden floors underfoot. Eleanor stood at the desk where her husband had once written checks, the place where all their decisions had been made, the place where it all began. Now, it was just hers. Her fingers hovered over the papers in front of her, the final revisions of the estate. It felt like an act of quiet rebellion, an ending of sorts, but not one she had expected. She had spent years being the dutiful daughter, the mother, the wife. But now all that was left to give was something more meaningful, something that would outlive them all. She flipped through the final drafts with practiced ease, her eyes scanning the numbers and clauses, the stipulations she had set in place. Everything had been divvied up exactly as it needed to be: the house, the property, the funds. But now she was adding something new, something they could never take from her. Her pen hovered over the line that would divert the funds meant for her family's inheritance. She could almost hear Tyler's voice, demanding his share, and Laurie's polite, cold indifference. Emily's whimpering plea, desperate for a piece of a life she never really cared to understand. They would never get what they thought they deserved. Instead, she would give the money to those who truly needed it, those who would appreciate what they had. She wrote it down in the final will: funds diverted to educational programs, 2 students per year, both from single-parent households. A smile, small but satisfied, curled at the edges of Eleanor's lips as she filled in the next line. The house would not be a home for anyone who had ever taken her for granted. It would not be a trophy to display at family gatherings or a bargaining chip to be used in their endless manipulation. Instead, it would serve as something that had true value: a historical exhibit, a museum dedicated to what had once been the Graydon legacy. Her principal's desk, her life's work, would sit as part of the exhibit, a reminder of what she had built. She had thought about leaving it to them, thought about the kindness of giving them the memories they'd always wanted, the ones they thought were owed to them. But as her pen hovered over the paper, she realized something. This would hurt them more. It wasn't the inheritance they wanted. It wasn't the house or the money or the status. It was the permanence of it, the knowledge that they would never be able to claim what was hers. Ruth's voice echoed in her mind, soft but clear. That'll sting worse than exclusion, its permanence. Eleanor smiled again, the weight of Ruth's words grounding her. Exactly, Eleanor whispered to herself, her voice low, steady. They can watch me help strangers for decades. The legacy they hadn't earned would now be a part of something far greater. It would be about the people who would learn from her story. People who, unlike her family, would take the lessons she had left and build something better. They would understand the value of hard work, of sacrifice, of true legacy. As Eleanor signed the final page, the house outside seemed to grow even quieter. It was as if the world had paused, just for a moment, as if acknowledging the weight of her decision. There would be no grand gesture, no family gathering to mark the occasion. Just the steady, unwavering certainty that this was the right path. She placed the pen down, the task completed. It was done. Just as Eleanor stood up to file the documents, her phone buzzed across the desk. She glanced at the screen, expecting another email from her lawyer or Ruth, but instead, it was from Emily. "You win." The simplicity of the message stung more than anything Emily could have said. No apologies, no understanding. Just a simple concession. Eleanor read it once, twice, and then set the phone down, her fingers brushing against the cool surface of the desk. She didn't feel triumph. Not exactly. It wasn't about victory. It was about finality. About ending a cycle that had dragged on for too long. She wasn't waiting for approval anymore. She wasn't waiting for anyone to change. The house outside was still quiet, and as Eleanor stood there, the evening sun casting long shadows through the windows, she realized she was free. And for the first time in years, she felt completely, undeniably free. The door to the past was closed. It was time for the future. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, a cup of tea cooling in front of her. The day had passed quietly, like so many before it. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath Ruth's movements, the rhythm of the house settling into its new stillness. Eleanor had grown accustomed to this peace, but today there was something different in the air. Her eyes wandered to the corkboard above her desk, where photographs of her old school and her former students had been pinned. Memories of a life lived for others, of days spent shaping young minds, of moments she'd never allowed herself to forget, even when the world around her had turned its back. She reached for the envelope that had arrived earlier in the day, its contents small, but heavy with significance. The handwriting on the front was unfamiliar, but something about it made Eleanor pause. She opened it slowly, careful not to tear the paper. Inside was a letter, handwritten in neat script. Dear Mrs. Graydon, I just wanted to say thank you. I read about you in the paper and wanted to let you know that you made a difference in my life. I was a student at your school a few years ago, and though I was never one of the special kids, you always saw me. You believed in me when no one else did. I'm in college now, and I know I wouldn't be here without you. Thank you for everything. You'll never know what it meant to me. Eleanor read it twice, the words settling into her chest like a weight lifted. She could feel the moisture in her eyes, the kind that came from a deep well of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Gratitude. Not for herself, but for what she had given. For the impact she'd made in the quiet ways no one had ever noticed. She slowly pinned the letter to the corkboard, right above a photo of her old school, a picture of students gathered outside, their faces bright and hopeful. A new generation, one she had shaped, one that had carried her work forward in a way her family never would. As the letter fluttered in place, a tear slipped down her cheek, though she didn't wipe it away. The emotion wasn't about loss. It was something softer, something richer. It was about being seen. Mail day? Ruth's voice interrupted her thoughts, and Eleanor turned to see Ruth standing in the doorway, a warm pie in her hands, her face creased with the familiar expression of someone who had long understood the quiet moments of life. Pie day, but close, Ruth added, her tone light but full of affection. She placed the pie on the counter, its sweet scent filling the room, but Eleanor didn't reach for it right away. She was still lost in the quiet weight of the letter, the impact of a life that had been seen, even if only by someone she'd never met. Eleanor smiled, her fingers still resting on the letter as if it were a precious artifact. Feels different to be seen, she said, her voice soft and steady. Ruth stepped closer, her eyes gentle as she looked over Eleanor's shoulder at the letter. You weren't invisible, she said, her voice warm, carrying the weight of years spent witnessing Eleanor's struggles. They just refused to look. Eleanor didn't say anything for a moment, her gaze still fixed on the letter pinned to the corkboard. It was true, wasn't it? She had spent so long being overlooked, not just by her family, but by the world. They had never truly seen her, her worth, her sacrifices, her strength. And yet, here, in the quiet of this new life she was building, someone else had. Someone who would carry her legacy forward, even if her family would never understand. I suppose that's what it was all along, Eleanor said, her voice quiet. They never looked. Ruth's smile softened. No, they didn't. Eleanor stood, finally turning away from the board, and took a deep breath. She felt lighter now. the weight of the years she had spent in the shadows of others' expectations slipping away like dust. She walked over to the counter and picked up a slice of the pie Ruth had brought. "Thank you," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion, "for seeing me." Ruth didn't need to answer. She just reached for her own piece of pie, a knowing look passing between them. The words weren't necessary anymore. They had both spent too long in the spaces between what was said and what was felt. Eleanor sat back down at the table, the slice of pie on her plate. But she didn't feel the hunger she thought she might. Instead, she felt full in a way she hadn't in a long time. Full of something deeper than sustenance, something that spoke of understanding, of recognition. The world might have missed her, but the ones who mattered, the ones who had truly seen her, understood the quiet strength it took to live a life not dictated by others' needs. And that, Eleanor realized, was enough. The bench outside Willow Glen was warm from the afternoon sun, but Eleanor didn't mind. The air had a softness to it, the kind that made it easier to think. Or not think, if that was what she needed. She had come here for moments like this, moments of stillness where the past couldn't reach her. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the gentle movements of the garden, the flowers swaying slightly in the breeze. It was a tranquil scene, quiet and deliberate. No noise, no expectations, just peace. And then she heard footsteps. At first, she didn't look up. She didn't need to. She knew who it was, even before Emily's voice broke the silence. "Grandma?" Eleanor turned slowly, her eyes meeting Emily's. The girl was standing a few feet away, her posture rigid, as if she hadn't quite figured out how to approach her yet. Her face was pale, the usual lightness in her eyes replaced by a look Eleanor hadn't seen before. Desperation, maybe. Or regret. For a long moment, Eleanor didn't speak. Just let the quiet stretch between them like an unspoken question. She knew what was coming. She knew the rehearsed apology, the practiced humility. It was all too familiar by now. But she wasn't interested in the apology. Not anymore. Finally, Eleanor patted the empty space on the bench beside her. She didn't invite Emily in with words, just with the gesture. But even that felt like a small, final courtesy. Emily hesitated for a moment, her fingers curling nervously around the strap of her purse before she sat down next to Eleanor. Her gaze dropped to the ground, her shoulders stiff. "I just want to start over," Emily said after a beat, her voice soft, almost pleading. Eleanor didn't look at her. Instead, her focus remained on the garden in front of her, on the quiet life that had taken root around her. "You started over when you laughed and thought I wouldn't remember," Eleanor replied, her voice calm, steady. But there was an edge to it now, something that couldn't be masked. Emily's breath caught, her face flushing slightly at the reminder of the words she had said. Careless, cruel words meant to wound. She was quiet for a moment, her gaze still fixed on the ground, as if the weight of those words had finally settled in her chest. "What do I need to say?" Emily asked, her voice a little shaky now, as though the rehearsed lines she had come with were slipping away. Eleanor took a slow breath, her gaze never leaving the horizon. The sunlight reflected off the trees, casting long shadows across the path. She could hear the distant hum of voices from the community center. But it was nothing compared to the stillness that wrapped around them now. "There's no phrase that replaces character," Eleanor replied, her voice quiet but sharp. "You can say whatever you want, Emily, but it doesn't matter. Not anymore." The words hung in the air, thick and final. Emily's face crumpled slightly, the mask she had been holding onto faltering, cracking. Her hands twisted together in her lap, the weight of the moment sinking in. She hadn't expected Eleanor to make it so simple, so final. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the soft rustling of leaves in the trees, the occasional chirp of a bird. Eleanor sat perfectly still, her posture unbroken, as if she were watching everything and nothing all at once. Emily, however, couldn't sit still. Her shoulders began to tremble slightly, her breath coming in short gasps. Finally, she turned her head to the side, her eyes brimming with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry for what I said. I never should have." Eleanor didn't turn to look at her. She didn't need to. Emily's sobs came quietly at first, then with a desperation that shook her entire frame. The sounds of her regret, of the weight she had carried for so long, were loud in the stillness of the afternoon. But Eleanor didn't reach for her, didn't comfort her. She simply sat there, watching the world unfold around them, unmoved. Emily's crying grew softer as the minutes passed, her shoulders shaking with the release of all the things she had never said. Eleanor let it happen, let the tears fall, because she knew there was nothing she could give her. The moment had passed. Emily had never understood what it meant to truly see someone, and no apology could erase that. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Emily fell silent. The air was thick with her unsaid words, her brokenness. But Eleanor remained steady, unshaken. She was done with apologies, done with the performance. Without a word, Emily stood up, wiping her eyes and taking a deep breath. She hesitated for a moment, as if hoping for some kind of acknowledgement, but there was nothing. Eleanor didn't move. She didn't look at her. There was nothing left to give. Emily glanced at her one last time before walking away, her steps heavy with the knowledge that this visit hadn't undone anything. Eleanor stayed where she was, her gaze fixed on the horizon, the sky turning soft shades of pink as the day began to fade into evening. It was done. And in that silence, Eleanor felt something shift inside her, something lighter, something that had been absent for far too long. She wasn't waiting anymore. She was free. The quiet hum of the house was almost too much for Eleanor to bear. She moved slowly through the room, her eyes scanning the desk cluttered with old papers, reminders of things that had once held weight but now felt distant, irrelevant. The edges of the wooden desk, worn by years of use, caught the fading light from the window, and she took a moment to breathe in the stillness. Everything had been reduced to this. One last sweep through the remnants of a life lived for others, for expectations that had never been her own. The photo on the desk caught her eye, the only one she had kept. It was of Emily, young and bright, her face framed by a half-smile, the kind of smile that once made Eleanor believe there was still hope for her family, still a chance to be understood, but not anymore. Eleanor walked over to the desk, her fingers brushing against the glass of the frame, the coolness of it familiar, yet distant. She had never been one to hold on to things for sentiment's sake. But this photo, this small reminder of what could have been, had stayed with her. It had once represented a dream of connection, of love that was shared. Now it was just another piece of the past that no longer fit. With a slow, deliberate motion, Eleanor picked up the frame and placed it face down on the desk. She turned, walking over to the file cabinet, where she had already prepared a folder. The label was simple: Legacy, Closed Threads. Her fingers hovered over the photo for a moment longer, as if saying a final goodbye to something she had never truly had. Then, with a steady hand, she slid the photo into the folder, the paper sliding across the surface with the softest of sounds. She sealed it shut. The weight of the action settled over her. But it wasn't the weight of loss. It was the weight of closure. She was no longer holding on to what had once been. No more hoping, no more pretending. It was done. The past had no claim on her. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Eleanor straightened, the quiet movements of the house and the steady rhythm of the world outside all momentarily forgotten. Ruth's voice came from the other side, warm and familiar. Lunch? Eleanor didn't hesitate. Only if we have vinegar slaw, she called back, her voice steady, lighter than it had been in years. Ruth's laugh came quickly, rich and full of affection. You're impossible? The sound of Ruth's footsteps echoed in the hall as she made her way to the kitchen, and Eleanor, for the first time in days, allowed herself to feel a flicker of something close to peace. Ruth had been with her through so many of the things that could never be undone, had stood by her when no one else had. Her friendship, her understanding, those were the things that had kept Eleanor from losing herself entirely. Eleanor slowly walked to the kitchen, the folder with Emily's photo tucked into her bag. She could feel the weight of it, but it was a weight she could carry now, a weight that didn't drag her down. Ruth was already at the counter, pulling open a jar of pickles with an exaggerated groan. She caught Eleanor's eye and raised an eyebrow. Not much of a lunch without the slaw, but I thought I'd get started. Eleanor smiled, a real smile this time, the kind that carried no pretense, no weight of past expectations. It felt unfamiliar, but welcome. You know, Eleanor said as she took a seat at the table, I think I'm finally getting the hang of this. Ruth's smile softened as she set the jar down. Getting the hang of what? Of being seen for who I am, Eleanor replied, her voice quiet but steady. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the window, where the sunlight was now soft and warm. No more pretending, no more waiting, just living. Ruth sat down across from her, placing the jar of pickles between them. She studied Eleanor for a moment, then nodded slowly. Feels like a long time coming. Eleanor didn't respond right away. Instead, she reached for the napkin beside her plate and began to write. The words came easily now, as though they had been waiting for her to find them. She wrote them out with the same steady hand she had used when making her final decisions. Quiet, deliberate. You did the right thing. They were never owed everything. She sealed the note carefully, tucking it into her Bible on the shelf, just as she had done with so many other memories and thoughts she needed to keep close, yet separate. Ruth stood beside her, her fingers gently touching the top of the Bible, as if understanding the weight of the letter without needing to read it. Think you'll ever show them? Ruth asked, her voice low but full of understanding. Eleanor smiled softly. No, they've already seen what they needed to. Ruth's eyes softened, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to prove. The house, the legacy, the years of waiting, they were all behind her now. The future lay ahead, silent and open, and for the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt she could step into it, fully and without hesitation. Let's eat, Ruth said, breaking the silence, her voice as comforting and steady as ever. You've earned it. Eleanor didn't need to say anything more. She sat back, the weight of her decisions finally settled, the knowledge that she had done the right thing settling in her bones. It was time to live. The auditorium buzzed with a quiet energy, the seats filled with the faces Eleanor had taught, shaped, and inspired over the years. The rows were packed, the air thick with anticipation and the faint murmur of conversations that ebbed away as she walked to the podium. A microphone creaked under her hand as she adjusted it, the soft hum of the room becoming a silence that enveloped her. A hush that could only mean one thing. They were waiting for her. She had thought about what she would say for weeks. How could she put everything into words when the journey had already been lived in silence? The years spent building, creating, teaching, those were the things that defined her, not the house, not the money, not the things they thought she owed them. Eleanor stood tall at the podium, the weight of the moment heavier than the microphone before her. She had taken the stage in a different way now. This wasn't a performance. It was a declaration. We are not burdens, she began, her voice steady but powerful, cutting through the room like a blade. We are blueprints. We are the foundation upon which others will build. We are the ones who teach, who mold, who guide. And we are the ones who decide when it's time to leave the old behind and create something better. Her words landed in the room, each syllable like a stone tossed into a pond, rippling outward and settling into the hearts of everyone who had gathered to hear her speak. She could see their faces, some familiar, some new, but all of them listening, truly listening. They weren't just hearing her, they were understanding her. The room was filled with the weight of that realization. Too many times, she continued, we are made to feel as if we owe something to those who came before us. But the truth is, we owe it to ourselves. We owe it to the generations who will follow us, to make sure that they inherit something better than what we were given. Eleanor paused, her gaze sweeping over the audience, landing on the familiar faces of former students, now adults. They were no longer the children she had taught. They were the architects of their own futures. And in them, she saw the seeds of change. Her legacy, not in things or wealth, but in people, in their choices, their futures. A wave of applause broke out, at first hesitant but growing stronger with each passing second. Eleanor let it wash over her, not as validation but as recognition. This was what mattered. This moment of connection, this understanding that could never be replaced by the things that had once been so important. Noah Delgado, sitting in the back of the room, his arms crossed but his expression soft, watched her with a quiet pride. He had known Eleanor for years, but today, it was different. There was no more hesitation in her, no more second-guessing. She had found her voice, and it was louder than any inheritance could ever be. Ruth sat in the second row, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, the corner of her mouth curved upward. The years of watching Eleanor hold back, of supporting her quietly, had led to this moment. She had always known Eleanor's strength. Now, everyone else did too. The applause echoed through the room, long and honest, a recognition of the woman Eleanor had become, the one who had quietly carried everyone else's weight for so long. And now, she was finally carrying herself. When the room quieted, Eleanor took a deep breath. Feeling the weight of the moment settle into her bones, she had made it through this. The speech wasn't just for them, it was for her. A declaration that she had finally stepped into herself, into the legacy she had built. Not the one others had expected her to create, but the one she had always deserved to leave. She stepped away from the podium, the applause still ringing in her ears, the weight of it settling into her chest. And as she walked off the stage, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the podium, she said quietly to herself, "That'll do." And it was enough. More than enough. Eleanor had finally done what she came here to do. Her legacy wasn't in the house. It wasn't in the things she had left behind. It was in the lives she had touched, the students who carried her lessons forward. The people who would remember her, not for the inheritance she had denied them, but for the life she had chosen to live on her own terms. And that, she realized, was the greatest gift she could ever give. The envelope was heavier than she expected. Eleanor slid the knife through the paper, the crisp tear marking the moment as her fingers grazed the edges. She pulled out the contents and unfolded the letter, her gaze immediately drawn to the headline that slapped her in the face. Obituary. Eleanor Graydon, 78, matriarch of the Graydon family estate, passes away. She exhaled a soft laugh, the sound genuine but tinged with the disbelief that had become so familiar. "Well, that's dramatic," she muttered to herself, shaking her head as she scanned the rest of the text. The obituary spoke of her life in a polished, almost saintly light, as if her years of sacrifice were the pinnacle of some grand narrative. The words felt like they were written for someone else, a fictional version of herself who had never truly existed. Her fingers hovered over the paper, the absurdity of it sinking in. It wasn't the first time she'd read something about her death. Her family had long made their assumptions, their expectations. She wasn't surprised by the obituary itself. What surprised her was that someone had felt compelled to send it, to commemorate her while she was still very much alive. They had been waiting for her to disappear, as if her worth had already been calculated. She could feel a mix of something close to amusement and resentment bubbling beneath the surface. They had already written her off. Yet here she was, still living, still breathing, still carving out the life they thought they would control. Without hesitation, Eleanor pinned the obituary to the wall next to the Principal of the Year plaque that had long since lost its sheen but never its meaning. She smiled as she stepped back to take it in. The contrast was stark. An obituary for a life they imagined she would lead, next to a small, humble recognition of the one she had actually lived. Ruth walked in, her familiar presence grounding the moment. She took in the sight of the obituary, her eyes softening as she leaned against the doorframe. "Guess they figured you've done enough to be remembered," she said, her voice amused but with a touch of something deeper. Something like understanding. Eleanor glanced up from her work, her smile never faltering. "Maybe. But I'm still making breakfast," she replied. Her tone light, but there was something behind it, an affirmation of her defiance, her refusal to be defined by anyone else's expectations. The room was quiet for a moment, the silence heavy with the knowledge that Eleanor had lived on her own terms, even when they'd tried to take that from her. Ruth nodded, a small chuckle escaping her lips. She'd seen Eleanor through it all, through every challenge, every moment of doubt. Ruth understood better than anyone the weight of that silence. The weight of not being seen, of being dismissed by those who thought they knew better. They walked out to the patio, the warm light of the late afternoon wrapping around them as they settled into the chairs. The hum of life seemed distant here, quiet, peaceful, untouched by the drama of the world outside. The flowers in the garden bloomed without expectation, the breeze carrying the soft scent of the earth. Ruth took a deep breath, watching the sun stretch lazily across the horizon. "You're not waiting to die," she said, her voice low and soft. Eleanor glanced at her, the gentle smile never leaving her face. She leaned back in the chair, her fingers resting lightly on the arms of the chair, and stared out at the world beyond the fence. "No, I'm still correcting papers," she said, the words simple but full of meaning. For a moment neither of them spoke. The world moved around them, but here, in this quiet space, they were untouched by the things they had left behind. The past was gone. The future was wide open, and Eleanor had finally realized that it was hers to shape, not anyone else's. The gentle rustle of the trees was the only sound that filled the space between them. And for the first time in years, Eleanor felt the freedom that had eluded her for so long. "After everything, after all of it," Ruth said after a while, her voice thoughtful, "you've built something they'll never take from you." Eleanor nodded, her gaze steady. "They said, 'You're just waiting to die.' So I removed them from the will before breakfast." The words were a quiet declaration, a final truth. The world had tried to bury her, tried to write her off, but she had built something lasting, not in what she left behind, but in the choices she had made, in the life she had finally started to live. And no obituary, no will, no expectations could ever change that. It was done. She had freed herself, and nothing could take that away.